You might have to upgrade your PS5 for the next biggest game. The new PS5 update is out now. This is the best feature you're not using on your PS5. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the midweek update here on PSReady. I have some great stories for you today, starting out with Jedi Survivor. This game is right around the corner, and the more I see of it, the more excited I get because it looks like just everything about the first game, but done better. I'm playing through the first game again right now, trying to get caught up on the story again, just because I haven't played it since it came out, which was like a few years ago at this point, which is crazy because it still feels like a new game to me. If you've never played Jedi Fallen Order before, you've got to get through it before Survivor comes out because it's actually one of the better Star Wars stories we've gotten in a really long time, and it looks like everything in Survivor is just picking up where the last game left off, but 5 years later. The one and only drawback of this game versus the first one, though, is that they have dramatically increased the amount of storage you're going to need on your console to play Jedi Survivor, and it's really getting to a point where I would consider it egregious. This game on your PS5 is going to take up over 150 gigabytes, which really sucks because, you know, the PS5 out of the box, it only has 680 gigabytes of usable storage, which is crazy, right? Like last generation, 500 gigabytes right out of the gate didn't feel like enough for the PS4, and to essentially only get about 200 gigabytes more on the PS5 is crazy when you consider how much bigger games are getting. We saw it for a little bit where the PS5 version of PS4 games would be a lot smaller and it was pretty cool, but now that we're getting next gen only games like Jedi Survivor coming out and they're going to be around 150 gigabytes, I mean, this is getting to the point where you're only going to be able to have like 4 or 5 games on your PS5 if you don't upgrade the SSD. Thankfully, upgrading the SSD is getting cheaper and cheaper, like the bigger games are coinciding super well with the prices falling on SSDs. My favorite one is the Samsung 980 Pro. They do have a 990 Pro out. I've just seen articles saying that that drive is prone to failing, and that's fine because the 980 Pro is nice and fast. I still use it. I've had it in my PS5 for over a year at this point. It works absolutely fine, and I've done some crazy stuff, right? I've transferred games to it from the internal SSD and vice versa. I've taken it out and put it in other PS5s. I've even tried it in my PC. This drive works absolutely fine, and I can't recommend it enough. I think right now it should be around $150 for a 2 terabyte version of it, and I've seen the 1 terabyte version fall to around $70. But honestly, seeing games like Jedi Survivor that are going to be 150 gigabytes, I think you should definitely just go for the 2 terabyte option. And these 4 terabyte drives that we've been seeing more and more lately, they're looking a lot more appealing if every big single player game like this is going to take up over 100 gigabytes of space. I mean, it's just getting absolutely out of control. They tried to negate it in Destiny 2 when that game was ballooning in storage size by sunsetting. People didn't really like that, and the game is already getting back to where it was before they sunset a bunch of content in that game. So yeah, games are just getting bigger. You should probably upgrade your SSD sooner rather than later. The weirdest thing about Jedi Survivor, though, is that it's the biggest on PS5. The Series S has the smallest install. I think I saw it was like 50 gigabytes or around 45 maybe. And then on the Xbox Series X, it's pretty close to where the PS5 is at, but still, the PS5 has the biggest install of all of the next-gen consoles. Kind of nuts. This video is sponsored by Raycon. You've definitely heard of Raycon before. They're high-quality earbuds that won't cost you an arm or a leg, but they still have awesome features that you would expect. When you choose Raycon, you're paying half the price of other brands, but you're getting the exact same quality, which is awesome. I also think it's pretty cool that they don't outsource their design. They have their own in-house team that was sourced from brands like Bose and Peloton. They've got all the features you'd expect, like being water and sweat resistant, which is awesome if you're at the gym. They've got tap controls, and if they don't fit you out of the box, they come with a whole bunch of custom ear tips. So they fit great for when I take long phone calls, want to listen to my favorite podcast, or listen to music for hours on end. And finally, the everyday earbuds have 8 hours of playtime. When you use the charging case, you can get up to 32 hours of battery life with your everyday earbuds. And it's cool that they come in a pretty wide variety of colors, including carbon black, electric blue, flare red, rose gold, and frost white. When you want to buy a pair, click the link down in the description or head to buyraycon.com/PSReady for 15% off your purchase. Huge shout out to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Next up on the list here, there's an interesting survey coming out that basically says the majority of PS5 users don't care about the features that come with the DualSense. Stuff like haptic feedback, adaptive triggers, everything that makes the PS5 kind of feel next gen with the controller at least. People don't really care to use all that much. And this reminded me of a survey we got a few months ago that was really surprising as well, where people were asked if they play in performance mode or quality mode, and the vast, like extremely vast majority of people say they either don't notice 60 frames per second or they really prioritize quality mode first and foremost. And when that story came out, I was shocked. I was like, there's no way people are playing at 30 FPS versus 60 FPS and actually preferring that. And it turned out that basically all of the people quote retweeting the story were using that as a like come to Jesus moment, where they were like, look, I'm going to be honest here. I play at 30 FPS more often than not, and I don't really care about having 60 FPS. But then when we saw these stories about Redfall, where it was going to be a 30 FPS game on Xbox Series X, people were pretty pissed off about it. So it seems like for different types of games, people either prioritize graphics or frame rate, but for the most part, people don't really care. And now with the DualSense, which the most next-gen feeling feature of the entire PS5 console is the DualSense and its features, people don't really seem to care all that much about that either. And honestly, I think one of the biggest reasons for that would definitely be people just don't really want to use these features that suck battery life. Because if you look at the DualSense versus the Xbox Series X controller, it is absolutely embarrassing how much less battery life we get out of the DualSense and DualSense Edge versus something like the Series X controller or the Elite Series 2. And that goes all the way back to the PS3, whether it was the 360 controller versus the DualShock 3 or the DualShock 4 versus the Xbox One controller. Xbox has consistently across the board totally dominated PlayStation when it comes to battery life. And in all three of these controllers, the DualShock 3, the DualShock 4, and the DualSense, those extra features that the console uses to feel more next gen, those are the biggest reason why the battery life is so much less. DualShock 3, you had the 6-axis. DualShock 4, you had the big ass light bar on the back of the controller. The DualSense, you have the haptic feedback, the adaptive triggers, all of that stuff really sucks out the battery life of the controller. I don't really know what the solution here is, because obviously Sony is aware of the issue because they try really hard to make sure they optimize the battery with every update. I mean, we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the video with the new PS5 update. The trade-off 100% of the time is going to be less battery life for more features. I will say though, with the PS5 versus the PS4, the controller features that the DualSense has feel way less like a gimmick and actually like a feature I'd like to see supported with the PS6 going forward than I got with the DualShock 4. The DualShock 4 had a touchpad and a light bar, which were used kind of at the beginning of the generation and then pretty much never again. I think the most noteworthy feature I remember those being used for was tapping the controller on your hand to make the flashlight charge up in The Last of Us. That's honestly the only thing I could really think of, and that worked kind of well with the speaker in the controller, where it would sound like the batteries in the flashlight needed to be shaken up to actually work better. It was kind of cool, but that's really it. When you're talking about the DualSense, I mean, Returnal was a great example of a game using these features super well. I'll never forget the first time I picked up a weapon in Returnal and I had to pull in the trigger to shoot, and I was like, oh, cool. It has like feedback where I have to pull the trigger a little bit harder. And then it was like for secondary fire, pull the trigger even harder. And I didn't even know it could go in even farther. And it felt super cool getting that 2-stage trigger pull out of the controller. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is another great example of a game that uses the DualSense super well. Every gun in that game is totally unique, and it makes it feel even more unique when you have to pull the trigger harder for some guns, or pull it in all the way, or pull it in halfway, or you have alternate firing modes. Just all of these cool different features that you're able to get out of the controller is something that you cannot get on the Xbox Series X, which is super weird because the Xbox One controller messed around with stuff like this as well. Like the triggers vibrated in Forza. I remember playing the Xbox One for the first time and I was super curious about if they were going to support that going forward. And now I guess the Series X controller has that trigger vibration. It's just no other games use it. I think it's cool that Sony has supported this feature though with the DualSense in pretty much every game. I mean, even with something like Ghostwire Tokyo or Deathloop, two games that are owned by Xbox, you still get those DualSense features in those games. And in the third party, Resident Evil 4 has awesome DualSense features that I think everyone should try out once at least, just to see how cool these next gen features are. I definitely see why though people are kind of avoiding the next gen features of the DualSense controller, because they're like, hey, I don't really care if this is in the game if it's going to eat battery life. I would prefer a game not really use it because I want more battery life out of this controller that has terrible battery. Next up, you guys are going to be shocked, but Sony is implementing more price hikes around the world. Thankfully though, this time it's not for hardware and it's not in the US. In other countries, they're raising the price on all of their PC ports by a considerable amount, and there is evidence of this on Steam, which is crazy. So in Argentina, games are going from 5,999 pesos to 9,999 pesos. In Canada, they're going from 69 $69.99 to $79.99. In Chile, they're going from 39.5 thousand to 42,000, whatever their currency is. In China, they're going from 379 RMB to 414. Colombia, 194,000 to 219,000. In Japan, they're going from 5,900 to 75.90 yen. So yeah, these are all considerable increases in price. I looked on Steam though, because my computer is right here, and it doesn't look like Sony is raising the price of games here in the US, which is pretty cool because you already get a little bit of a discount if you're playing on PC versus the PS5. And that's just because all of these games are older games, right? Like they've been out on PS5 a while, they're already cheaper than full price on PS5, so they're kind of matching that up. Still, it is nice to see that they're not raising the price of either the PS5 or the games on Steam here in the United States, because they already did that once by raising the games from 60 to 70 bucks. And honestly, certain games I don't mind paying 70 bucks for, like God of War Ragnarok, but others, like the new PGA Tour game from EA, that game is an absolute technical mess from top to bottom, and I don't feel like it justifies the $10 increase in price at all. So it's like, depending on the game, I feel like it's worth it or not, but still, it is kind of interesting to see Sony raising prices of games around the world. I originally saw this because Jez Corden from Windows Central tweeted this out and said this is why competition is good, and I don't really see the point there. It's weird because I agree on consoles, but this is like a bad example, I think, because there is a lot of competition on PC. You have the Game Pass store, like the Xbox app, you have Epic Game Store, you have Ubisoft's launcher, you have EA's Origin app or whatever they're calling it now, and then obviously you have Steam. So there's a ton of competition. It's just Sony updating their prices because of inflation, which sucks, but you kind of understand what they're doing, I guess. And then finally, there is a new update for the PlayStation 5 now, and thankfully there are actual patch notes for it despite it being small. So Sony says, we've improved system software, performance, and stability. That's the classic line. But interestingly, they also say they've improved messages and usability on some screens, and they've updated DualSense Edge wireless controller device software to improve stability. Now, they're not specific on the DualSense Edge, so I'm really curious to try this out because I really think they're improving the battery life. Because just like the regular DualSense, the DualSense Edge has that issue that the regular one had at launch where it says that it's out of battery way before it's out of battery. Like mine will say, hey, you need to plug your controller in, it's out of battery, and then it'll go for like another 2 or 3 hours even, which is extra annoying on the Edge because the worst feature, like I mentioned earlier, of the DualSense is how bad the battery life is, but the Edge takes it to an entirely new level. So you're seeing that flashing battery indicator pretty much every night. If you charge this thing every night like I do, every time I use my PS5 for more than a couple hours, I end up seeing that flashing battery indicator. So I'm really hoping Sony has figured out a way to improve that on the DualSense Edge, even though it is kind of irritating that it was able to ship with that bug in the first place. Because yeah, it really sucks seeing that my battery is dead on my DualSense and then plugging it in only to realize that I could have just played for another 2 or 3 hours even. Because A, that ultimately kills the battery life of your controller, and B, it sucks that you can't swap out the batteries in the DualSense Edge as easily as you can the stick modules. I wish it was that easy because I wouldn't worry about charging the thing when it's not actually dead so much. But yeah, it's a frustrating issue that I hope this new software update fixes. Hopefully we get a bigger update towards the middle of the summer like we usually do that includes all the things we're still waiting for, like dynamic themes specifically, maybe even a web browser or something like that. But for right now, if Sony is focusing on battery life in the DualSense, that makes me happy, and it's good to see that we're still getting updates for the original PS5, especially with the Slim and the Pro looming on the horizon off there. They're not coming out anytime soon, it's just like they're there. So hopefully this update fixes battery life, we get those announcements soon, and also the new showcase is announced as well, because I think we really need it. Hype is down for PlayStation, and I feel like if we get a big showcase that announces new games we've never heard of that are coming out in the next 12 to 18 months, that will really generate some hype for the console.